I don't believe that the Fed should exist. It should be abolished. It's the engine of inflation, actually. So Trump, who has no grip on economics at all, whatever his other vices or virtues may be, he's an economic disaster. He wants to see the government reduce interest rates from, let's say, 6% down to 3%. This is going to be catastrophic. First of all, they can only adjust the short end of the rate. In other words, T-bill kind of rates. But they can only do that by creating more money. And what's going to wind up happening when he replaces Powell and gets somebody as the chairman of the Fed who will basically take his orders, we'll probably see short-term rates, is what I'm trying to say, go down. Meanwhile, the creation of all this extra money will cause long-term rates to go up. I think this would be a great speculation to go long the one and short the other over the next few years. But what should they do? They should leave it alone. They should attempt to abolish the Fed. That would be the right thing to do. Interest rates should be set by the market, not by bureaucrats or politicians who have their own agendas. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but the Fed has about 5,000 employees or something on that order. These people should be fired so they can go out and do something productive with their lives instead of perpetually damaging the economy. Money is the lifeblood of society. And when you play with the money, you're in effect poisoning the bloodstream of society. Look, in third world countries, where I've spent an awful lot of time, one of the reasons why they're poor is because perpetual inflation discourages savings. That makes it very hard for the average guy to get ahead, because in whatever country you are, you save the national currency. But if the national currency is basically toilet paper, it makes no sense to save. Not only that, but if you can get somebody to lend it to you, you borrow. And that amounts to a mortgage against your future earnings. It makes it hard for the average person to elevate himself because he can't build savings and he's encouraged to take on debt. So the answer to the question is we should have a solid, stable money. And that basically means gold. The inevitable is becoming the imminent at this point, because with the rise of the BRICS, they no longer really want to accept the dollar. The dollar is becoming a hot potato. It's the unsecured liability of the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is manifestly bankrupt. Not only that, but when you're using the dollar to trade, the U.S. government has you in a stranglehold. Look what happened to Russia. Their assets were basically confiscated by the U.S. government. So the thing is when any of these countries trade with each other, do the Chinese really want to accept the Indian rupee? Not really. I mean, it's just a fiat paper currency, and nobody wants to accept the yuan either. So you have to have some type of a numeraire, something that nobody else controls. And that's why throughout recorded history, gold has always been the best money. And we'll go back to gold because these countries don't trust each other, nor should they. Now, Bitcoin is a possible alternative to gold, but it's still early days for Bitcoin, and it has its own problem. I've been a Bitcoin supporter philosophically forever and a buyer since 2017. Bitcoin's got a lot of advantages, but it's got some disadvantages. So I don't know who's going to win out in the end, but I'll put my money on gold. Look, everybody ought to be afraid of Trump. Relative to the alternative, which was Kamala Harris, of course, Trump was the better choice because Kamala is actually a communist. So keeping it in context that Trump was much better than the alternative, he's a dangerous guy. He acts in a schizophrenic way. He's unpredictable. He's actually acting like a Caesar, arbitrarily putting on tariffs here, 50%, no, 200% for you, no, 500% for you if you don't do what I say, putting on sanctions to punish countries and change their internal policies. I think he's really out of control, quite frankly, and I think he's going to get worse. I think it's gone to his head. He's an egomaniac that's turned into a megalomaniac at this point. So yeah, I'm quite afraid of Trump. The fact that even though he said he was going to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, it's still going on. Why is it going on? Because the U.S. has continued to send the Ukraine money and weapons for the last 6 months. The war would have ended the day after the U.S. government stopped feeding the Ukraine money and weapons at a huge expense to the average American. It's completely insane. Iran controls the Persian Gulf, and in particular, the Straits of Hormuz. about a quarter of the world's oil passes through this narrow strait. It's only about 20 miles wide. At some point, if the Iranians are really pushed against the wall, they can close off all the oil that goes out of there from Saudi, from Iraq, from the UAE. It'll go nowhere. Oil prices would immediately shoot to $200 a barrel. And worse than that, oil would not be available. So it's something that's not talked about or acknowledged adequately. Well, can they really step in? Because in Yemen, which is one of the more backward countries in the world, there's a rebel group that are known as the Houthis, Ansar Allah, and they have driven away U.S. warships because missile technology today, even a nothing-nowhere country like Yemen, can keep the United States Navy at bay. So this is a situation which is potentially explosive.
Wow.
And the war between Israel and Iran is not over by any means. And it was very foolish on the part of Trump to get involved in a dust-up between two countries on the other side of the world. I mean, we have the Hatfields and the McCoys fighting in the Middle East, and Trump has decided to take sides, rather idiotically, quite frankly. So the best thing the U.S. can do, they say, well, we don't want to be an isolationist country. That's the wrong word. We want to be as a non-interventionist country where we don't stick our nose into other people's business. But in the meantime, he's been provoking the Russians, and this is very, very dangerous because you back a global nuclear power into a corner, you might get a really unpleasant surprise. And he might do the same thing with the Chinese, acting like a big man, a tough guy, keeping up this ridiculous image that he has. So, I'm afraid of what Trump may do. He's not a stable guy, I don't think. It doesn't seem that way. I understand why he can say that, because Trump is a huge fan of professional wrestling. But professional wrestling is one thing, and playing with nuclear powers is another thing. And is it 5D chess that Trump is playing? No, it's somebody that's acting like a 5-year-old kid playing in a sandbox. Well, look, I remember, because I was alive then, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where we really came within a hair's breadth of a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the U.S. And of course, I remember what it was like in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was in its death throes, and it looked like they might invade across the Fulda Gap and try to conquer Europe. That didn't happen either. But this is a time that it seems to me is as dangerous as those previous two times. How could he be any worse than Trudeau?
Oh, that's the question.
All of the leaders of all of the Western countries, I think without exception, are just horrible, degraded people. They're all cucks. They're all socialists. So no, I'm not a fan of absolutely any of them. Starmer in England is running the place into the ground. Macron in France. That guy in Germany, she's the best of the bunch, but she's not making any changes to really improve the situation.
Correct.
So the answer to the question is that Europe is a sinking ship, and the smart European would jump ship. Well, I'd suggest Argentina,
right,
because since the election of Javier Milei, this country is turning around rapidly. And my guess is that within 10 years, it'll once again, because it used to be, one of the most prosperous countries and one of the freest countries on the planet. So that's a good alternative for Europeans.